Hey, everyone. Tonight, we're going back to the Wild West. The version in movies is all dust clouds, saloons, and mysterious sheriffs who always seem to have just shaved and never sweat. The real West? It smelled worse. It was hotter, colder, and somehow windier than you expect. And if you'd been dropped there without warning, you wouldn't last a day. So get comfortable, dim the lights, and let's drift back to a world where the streets were made of mud, the nights were pitch black, and survival was mostly about how stubborn you could be. Imagine waking up in a frontier town just as the sun is coming up. The air is dry and carries the smell of dust, manure, and wood smoke. Someone nearby is already splitting logs. There's a rooster somewhere, but mostly it's quiet. Quieter than any morning you've ever heard. No cars, no buzzing power lines, no hum of a refrigerator, just the occasional creak of wagon wheels and a horse stamping its foot impatiently. The main street isn't paved, so the ground crunches under your boots. You immediately notice something that no one in a Western movie ever mentions: the smell, because there's no sewer system, and people dump chamber pots into the street at night. Add in the manure from all the horses and mules, and the sour smell of unwashed humans, and the West smells like a strange mixture of barnyard, smoke, and last night's stew left out too long. Water was another problem. Town wells weren't always clean, and creeks doubled as laundry spots, dishwashing areas, and occasionally bathtubs. If you were thirsty, you drank what was available and hoped you didn't regret it later. Dysentery wasn't just a word from a video game. It was a regular visitor. Travelers learned to boil water or just drink weak coffee all day, because at least the coffee had been boiled. Yes, it was bitter and full of grit, but it was safer than taking your chances with a bucket from the well that smelled faintly of something dead upstream. Bathing was rare, and not for lack of wanting to be clean. It was just too much trouble. To take a bath, you needed enough water to fill a tub, and you had to heat it yourself over fire. That meant chopping wood, hauling water, building a fire, and then carrying the hot water in buckets. By the time it was ready, you were sweaty again anyway. People bathed maybe once a week, if they were lucky, and even less in winter. Soap was often homemade, rough, and smelled faintly of lard. If you had hair long enough to wash, you probably did it in a separate bowl, because wasting a whole tub's worth of water just on your head would be unthinkable. Your clothes? You wore the same outfit for days. Washing clothes was another day-long project. Hauling water, boiling in a big pot, scrubbing clothes on a washboard, wringing them out by hand, and then hanging them to dry. It's one reason everyone smelled the same, and why visitors probably blended right in after an hour. When you picture a cowboy walking into a saloon with dust on his boots and a week's worth of sweat on his shirt, that's not because he's been on some daring cattle drive. That's just Tuesday. Let's talk about food for a moment, because food was rarely exciting. You might start your day with beans left over from last night, maybe fried in a pan with bacon grease, if you were lucky. There was bread, if someone had baked yesterday, but most of the time it was hardtack, a cracker so solid you could probably patch a roof with it. Coffee was thick and bitter, and sometimes stretched with things that weren't coffee, like roasted grain or even ground-up chicory root. You ate what was available, and you didn't complain too much because complaining took energy. Even when you got used to the smells and the food, you'd probably struggle with the weather. Frontier towns didn't have air conditioning or central heat, obviously, so you were at the mercy of the seasons. Summer was blistering. Winter meant ice on the inside of your windows and frost in your beard. The wind never seemed to stop, and if you were out on the prairie, you could watch a storm coming from miles away with no shelter in sight. And through all of this, you still had work to do, lots of it. Nobody got to sit around doing nothing. If you were living in town, you were probably running a shop, working as a blacksmith, hauling freight, or repairing wagons. If you were a farmer, you were up at dawn and busy until dark. Children worked, too. They carried water, gathered firewood, and helped with animals. Life in the West was less about gunfights and more about keeping everything from falling apart for one more day. But despite all of this, people stayed. They came west in huge numbers, willing to trade comfort for land, opportunity, and the idea of a fresh start. Maybe it was the open sky, or maybe it was just stubbornness. Because if there's one thing that kept the West going, it was stubborn people who refused to give up even when everything smelled terrible and their coffee tasted like burnt tree bark. So as we settle into this first part of the story, imagine yourself standing on that dusty main street, boots sinking into the mud, the wind blowing just enough grit into your eyes to make you squint. You can hear a hammer ringing on the anvil at the blacksmith shop, a dog barking somewhere down the road, and the distant sound of cattle. This is your world now, at least for the night. The West wasn't romantic, but it was real. And somehow, that's what makes it worth exploring. Take a moment to think about what part of frontier life you'd find the hardest. The smell of the food, or maybe the lack of showers. Leave me a comment with your answer. I'd love to know which one would have sent you running back east first. So, now that you've gotten used to the dusty streets and the general smell of everything, let's talk about one of the most basic things you need to survive. Water. It's one of those things we take for granted now. You turn a tap, you get clean water, no thought required. Out here, every sip is a gamble. And if you were new to the West, that gamble usually went badly at least once. Picture a small settlement in the 1870s. There might be one well, maybe two, and everyone uses them. Horses drink from them. Laundry is washed with them. Sometimes, those wells aren't quite deep enough. You might notice the water looks cloudy or smells faintly like old cabbage. People still drink it because they have no choice. Boiling water was recommended, but it wasn't always practical when you were tired from working all day and just wanted a drink. If you were traveling west, you'd have to rely on whatever water you could find. Wagon trains stopped at rivers, creeks, and puddles if that's all there was. The first people to get there got the cleanest water. The last people, well, they got water that looked like someone had stirred it with a stick. If you were unlucky, you'd drink too much without boiling it first, and then spend the next 2 days regretting every life choice you had ever made. Dysentery, cholera, and other charming diseases were not uncommon. In fact, cholera epidemics sometimes swept through entire wagon trains. If one person got it, others usually followed. It was like the world's least fun road trip. Bathing water wasn't just scarce. It was often reused. If you were lucky enough to have a tub, you'd heat water for the first person. Then everyone else would take turns using that same bath water until it was basically soup. The children usually went last, which meant that by the time it was their turn, the water had cooled and contained more dirt than it removed. Nobody minded much, because it was better than hauling and heating a fresh tub. Washing clothes required the same effort. Water hauled in buckets. Soap made from animal fat, a heavy washboard to scrub everything clean. Your hands would get raw and cracked from the lye in the soap. Clothes didn't smell fresh so much as less dirty. And if the wind blew dust while you were hanging them up to dry, they'd be covered again by the time you brought them in. But drinking water wasn't just about safety. It was about taste. Water could be heavy with minerals, leaving a metallic tang in your mouth. Or it could be full of silt, giving it a gritty texture. Imagine drinking a glass of water and crunching between your teeth afterward. This was so common that many settlers preferred weak coffee or watered-down whiskey, because at least those had been boiled or distilled. If you were on a cattle drive, water holes were a constant worry. The animals needed water as much as the cowboys did, and there were only so many places along the trail to stop. If the water hole had dried up or turned stagnant, there wasn't much you could do. You drank it anyway, because dehydration would kill you faster than bad water. People learned to tell the difference between water that would just make you sick and water that might actually kill you. There were also cultural differences about water use. Some Native American tribes bathed far more regularly than settlers, which often led to settlers calling them strange or wasteful. In reality, they were simply cleaner. The West was full of such little ironies. The people who saw themselves as civilized were often the ones who smelled the worst. Now, imagine you spent a long day working, chopping wood, repairing fences, hauling hay. You're sweaty, covered in dust, and your mouth feels like sandpaper. You walk to the well, lower the bucket, haul it up, and drink straight from the dipper. The water is lukewarm, tastes faintly of mud, and you're grateful for it anyway. This was normal. Refreshment didn't come with ice cubes and lemon slices. It came with a side of sediment. Of course, Bad water led to bad health. Stomach problems were so common that people just accepted them as part of life. Diarrhea wasn't considered an illness. It was just Tuesday. People carried little bottles of laudanum or castor oil and treated themselves. If it got worse, there wasn't much a doctor could do except tell you to drink more water, which felt like cruel irony. All of this meant that staying hydrated was a constant task, and it shaped how towns were built. You didn't just put a house anywhere. You built near water if you could. You dug wells first, then built barns, corrals, and homes around them. The well was the center of life, even if it was sometimes the cause of your troubles. And yet, people survived. They figured out which wells were safe, which streams ran cleanest, and how to avoid the worst sicknesses. They learned to add just enough coffee grounds to make boiling water taste like something. They learned to ration water for animals and gardens. They learned, in short, to work with what they had, because there was no other option. So as you think about that glass of water sitting next to your bed right now, perfectly clear and safe, take a moment to appreciate it. Out here, it wasn't just a drink. It was survival. Now I want to hear from you. If you had to drink water that looked cloudy but was your only choice, would you boil it first or just risk it? Drop a comment below and let me know which one you'd do if you were a thirsty pioneer. After you've had your gritty cup of water or bitter coffee, you'd probably want something to eat. Unfortunately, this was another area where the West was more about survival than pleasure. Most meals were whatever you could cook over a fire in a single pan. Beans with a great standby, cheap, filling, and able to survive long trips in a sack. People ate beans so often that they probably got tired of the sight of them, but they were reliable. Meat was usually salt pork or bacon if you were lucky, dried beef if you weren't. Fresh meat was a luxury unless someone had just hunted. When they did, the whole town might get a share. Stew for everyone until it was gone. Bread was either cornbread or sourdough, and sometimes biscuits if someone had enough flour and lard. The bread was dense and heavy, meant to last a long time. It didn't taste like the fluffy loaf you buy at a supermarket. It was more like a brick that happened to be edible. Butter and milk were luxuries, too. You only had them if someone nearby kept a cow. If that cow got sick or was sold, there went your dairy supply. Cheese was sometimes easy to find, but it was usually hard, salty, and aged to survive long journeys. If you wanted fresh produce, you had to grow it yourself, which meant tending a garden even after a long day of work. And then there was coffee. The West ran on coffee. Cowboys drank it before sunrise. Settlers drank it with every meal, and saloons even sold coffee to sober up customers before they staggered home. It was boiled in a pot until it was as thick as possible, then poured straight into a tin cup. There were no fancy creamers or sugar packets. If you had sugar, you hoarded it. Coffee was usually strong enough to dissolve a spoon if you left it in long enough. Desserts were rare but treasured. A pie might show up if fruit was in season. If someone had molasses, you might get a cake. But mostly, sweets were for holidays or special occasions. Children sometimes got a lump of sugar as a treat. Yes, just sugar, straight from a bag. It wasn't all bad. A well-cooked meal could be the highlight of a long day. But more often than not, you ate what you had, even if it was bland or slightly burned. Hunger didn't leave much room for complaining. Imagine finishing your meal and realizing that was it. No late-night snacks, no quick trip to a corner store. You ate until you were full or until the pot was empty, and that was the end. Food wasn't entertainment. It was fuel, and you were expected to keep going. So tonight, as you think about your own kitchen and your refrigerator full of options, imagine standing over a pot of beans, stirring them slowly, knowing this will be your breakfast, lunch, and dinner. It's not glamorous, but it kept the West alive. Which frontier meal do you think you miss most, bread, beans, or coffee? Leave me a comment with your answer, and maybe share what your emergency food would be if you had to live like this. You might think that after a hard day of hauling water and eating bean stew, sleep would come easy. And it did, but not always in the way you wanted. Beds were usually straw mattresses on wooden frames, sometimes just piles of blankets on the floor. The straw had to be changed regularly or it would start to smell. Bugs loved it. Privacy was rare. Whole families often shared a single room. If you had children, they might sleep 3 or 4 to a bed. If you lived in a bunkhouse, you shared space with everyone else, and snoring wasn't considered rude. It was just part of the background noise. Night noises were different, too. No cars, no streetlights, just silence, broken occasionally by a dog barking, a horse shifting in the barn, or the howl of a coyote. For someone from a city, it could be unsettling. Darkness was really dark. If the moon wasn't out, you couldn't see your hand in front of your face. People kept candles or oil lamps handy, but they were expensive to burn all night. And of course, there were pests. Mosquitoes in summer, mice in winter. If you lived near the woods, maybe a curious raccoon. Fleas and lice were just part of life. They itched, they annoyed you, and you dealt with it. When it rained, roofs sometimes leaked, so you might have to put a bucket next to your bed. When it snowed, the room might be so cold that your water bucket froze overnight. And if you had a fire on the hearth, you had to keep an ear out in case a spark jumped. Because house fires were terrifyingly common. Despite all this, people did sleep because they were exhausted. There was no staying up late to scroll through anything. You went to bed because it was dark, and you got up when the sun came up. Take a moment and imagine that silence, the kind so deep you can hear your own breathing. Imagine falling asleep to the sound of wind rattling the shutters, and knowing tomorrow will start at dawn no matter what. Would you sleep better in that kind of quiet, or would you miss the noise of modern life? Tell me in the comments if you think you'd find it peaceful or unsettling. Medicine on the frontier was a roll of the dice. Doctors were few and far between, and their tools were simple: a saw, a scalpel, and maybe some whiskey. Surgery was done without anesthesia if you couldn't afford chloroform, which meant you were expected to just grit your teeth and hang on. Most illnesses were treated with home remedies. If you had a fever, someone might give you willow bark tea. If you had a stomach ache, you might get castor oil. If none of that worked, you just hoped it passed. Accidents were common: falling from a horse, cutting yourself with an axe, stepping on a rusty nail. Infection was a constant danger. People lost fingers, arms, or whole lives, things we would now treat with antibiotics. Dentistry was brutal. Teeth were pulled with pliers. If you had a toothache, you might just live with it until it became unbearable. Then you found someone strong enough to pull it out. Childbirth was dangerous, too. Many women gave birth at home with only a neighbor or midwife to help. Some didn't survive. Some babies didn't either. It was just part of life, and families kept going. Doctors who did travel sometimes carried little black bags full of bottles: laudanum, morphine, quinine. The dosages weren't always exact. You trusted your doctor and hoped for the best. If you got sick out here, you were tough or you didn't make it. It was that simple. Would you trust a frontier doctor, or would you rather just let nature take its course? Leave a comment and tell me if you think you'd have survived medicine in the 1800s. If there was one thing that truly defined frontier life, it was work. The West was not a place where you had a slow morning with coffee and a book. The second the sun came up, the day began, and it did not end until there was no light left to work by. Fetching water was a daily chore, and usually someone small and unlucky got to do it. If you were a child, that probably meant you. You carried buckets from the well or creek, sometimes several trips before breakfast. Then there were the animals to feed: chickens to let out, cows to milk, horses to brush. If you were lucky enough to have a dog, it probably worked too, keeping the animals in line or guarding the property. After animals came the garden. You weeded, watered, and worried about rabbits stealing your hard work. If the season was right, you harvested. If it was wrong, you tried not to think about what you'd do if nothing grew. Then there were fences to mend, wagons to fix, and firewood to chop. Firewood was not optional. You needed it for cooking, for heat, for boiling that dubious water. People spent whole days just cutting and stacking wood because winter was always coming. Laundry day was its own ordeal: hauling water, boiling it, scrubbing clothes until your arms ached, then wringing them out and hanging them to dry. By the end of the day, you smelled of soap and smoke and were too tired to care. And all of this was before you even thought about cooking meals or sewing torn clothes or sweeping out the dust that blew in through every crack in the house. You could sweep 3 times a day and still crunch dirt under your boots by nightfall. Work was simply life. There were no weekends off. There was no me time. If you sat down too long, someone would hand you something to do. But the strange thing was, people were proud of this. Hard work was proof that you were surviving. Imagine ending a day like that, sitting on the porch as the sun goes down, hands sore but satisfied. That was a small reward, a moment of peace before tomorrow's work started again. If you were out there, which chore do you think would drive you crazy first? Hauling water, doing laundry, or chopping wood? Leave a comment and tell me which one you'd absolutely trade away if you could. Westerns love to show dramatic shootouts at high noon, but those were rare. The real dangers were less exciting and far more common. Fires were one of the biggest threats. Buildings were made of wood, roofs were thatched or shingled, and stoves were made of iron that got dangerously hot. One bad spark, and a whole town could burn before anyone could stop it. People kept buckets of sand and water nearby just in case. Accidents were another daily hazard. You could fall off a horse, break a leg, get caught under a wagon wheel, or step on a rattlesnake. Tools were sharp, animals were unpredictable, and medical help was far away. Diseases were everywhere. Cholera, smallpox, measles, tuberculosis. Any of them could sweep through a settlement and leave tragedy behind. Children were especially vulnerable. Parents buried children far too often, sometimes several in the same year. Then there was weather. Blizzards could trap you indoors for weeks. Tornadoes could flatten a homestead in minutes. Drought could wipe out your crops, leaving you with nothing to eat. Nature didn't care how hard you worked. It just did what it wanted. And of course, there were occasional conflicts, not just with other settlers or native tribes, but with neighbors. Land disputes could turn bitter. Sometimes people simply disappeared, and no one asked too many questions. Despite this, most people lived as carefully as they could and hoped luck was on their side. When bad things happened, they rebuilt, mourned, and kept going. If you were living there, which danger would worry you most? Fires, sickness, or storms? Tell me in the comments which one you'd lose the most sleep over. Women worked as hard as anyone else, sometimes harder. They kept the home, cooked meals, raised children, and often helped with planting and harvesting too. A frontier wife might spend the entire day cooking. Breakfast at dawn, dinner at noon, supper at sunset. Childbirth was frequent and dangerous. Families were large because not every child survived to adulthood. Children worked young, carrying water, collecting eggs, minding younger siblings. Schooling was short if it existed at all, because there was always work to do. But women also ran businesses. They kept boarding houses, worked as seamstresses, opened shops. Some became midwives, others ran saloons. Life gave them no choice but to be resourceful. Children learned quickly that life wasn't fair. If they were lucky, they had a few toys, a carved wooden doll, a ball made from rags. Mostly, playtime was rare. And yet, there were moments of joy. Dances, picnics, barn raisings. Any excuse to gather and celebrate. People sang, played fiddles, told stories. They made happiness where they could. Would you trade your modern childhood for a frontier one? Leave a comment and tell me if you'd enjoy that freedom, or if you'd miss school and playtime too much. For all its hardship, the West had a kind of beauty that kept people there. Imagine standing on a hill at night, no lights anywhere for miles, and seeing more stars than you ever thought existed. Imagine watching a sunset stretch across the horizon with nothing blocking the view. That quiet, that open sky was its own reward. People felt small, but also free. They were carving lives out of wilderness, and they took pride in every fence post and every mile of road. And that is where we'll leave the West tonight. Quiet, dusty, a little bit uncomfortable, but still alive in memory. It wasn't glamorous. It wasn't easy, but it was real. If you enjoyed drifting back to this time with me tonight, let me know in the comments which part of frontier life you think you'd survive, and which part would send you running back east. If you'd like to help others find these sleepy history stories, please give this video a like. Share with a friend who loves history, and subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Your comments and thoughts really do make these stories better, so leave one before you drift off to sleep. Thanks for spending this quiet evening with me. Good night.